the subject of today is again been a result of some sort of a poll, right? It's been a part of the popular opinion. So the subject of today is about the splints and orthotics. Now, I must say that, you know, I have commented and talked on this subject since the beginning of days and the endless number of times, right? So you see, like, you know, I was actually even before, like maybe an hour ago, I was like thinking, how many times did I actually speak about it, right? So you see, like, okay, let's take conservatively 25 years of talking about this subject. Let's say if I do it conservatively 50 times a year, right? So you see, that means that I'm kind of well into thousands of times of like really delivering the sort of relatively expanded conversation on this subject. However, of course, our understanding keeps improving. You know, certain illustrations and verbal formulas, they keep improving as well, right? And at the same time, it's an important subject, right? Because when it comes to both the beginners and more kind of seasoned parent therapists, right? So you always face this question, right? Do we, you know, how do we handle the kind of strange positions, right? So the strange positions of the feet, the strange positions of the hands, and in particular, right? So, and of course, this is where the orthotics, they come in their very sort of obvious and like the common sense way. And that's why it's important to really put everything in perspective and understand like what really could be their use, you know, the use and potential benefits, what would be the minimizations of damages, and when to use them and when not to use them, right? So as always, we are going to use two main sources of visuals, right? That would be the good old, well, not so old actually, internet search, right? So you see, if you put it this way, right? I started answering the question about the orthotics and the splints way before, I mean, like at the dawn of the internet era, right? So before Google was born, for sure. That's really, well, Yahoo was there, Google was not. So that's kind of, I mean, if you think about it, so there's a whole generation of people who can't imagine there was a time when Google was not around, right? So, but Google has helped us with the search for the illustrations and visuals. So that's going to be very helpful. And of course, you know, I'm going to use some of the pictures from our own assessments, right? And as always, in the kind of when we put it into the public domain, especially with the feed, it's kind of easy to sort of anonymize them and just put some anonymous foot or anonymous hand. So, but that's actually what is going to help you to see things clearer and understand better how the whole thing works. Okay, voila.
Yes, visibility, all right.
Visibility is fine. All right, so let's start, as we often do, with the search in Google, right? So I have typed in here the orthoses, and the dictionary gives me the word. So a brace, splint, or other artificial external device serving to support the limbs or spine to prevent or assist relative movement. So that's a term. Actually, an interesting thing is that actually that the dictionary is very often being a very kind of mild and peaceful version of a definition. So it's very measured approach. So you see, as you will see here, it's a kind of mild definition. Serving to support, right? Prevent or assist relative movement. It doesn't say anything, you know, used here to correct, to realign, and everything else. So it doesn't make any ambitious statements. Just prevent or assist relative movement. So it's a very mechanical definition, right? So let's keep this in mind. Now, here we go into the types of the orthosis: cervical for the neck, right? So then the spine, the arm, the wrist, hand, hips, knee, ankle, foot. So the most popular, of course, the one that we meet the most often is the ankle foot orthosis, which is called the AFO, right? So you see sometimes there is also the, the DAFO, right? So you see, which also gets the, the dorsal component, but, overall, that's what is being used most often. Now, if we move from dictionary, which is kind of impartial, to the medical term, right? So you see here, Michigan medicine is already giving us a lot more ambitious definition, right? An orthosis is a device designed to improve biomechanical function, encourage proper joint alignment, or to protect an existing limb. So this is where we see two of these main definitions, right? Improve and encourage the joint alignments. So this is the term biomechanical function, the term joint alignment. So where biomechanical function typically would be sort of looking at the mobility, right? So the range of movement. And of course, we also seeing this holy grail, the joint alignment, something which is not straight, being considered as not good, right? So aligned versus mal-aligned, misaligned, poorly aligned, badly aligned, and all these terms, right? So what is the difference between orthosis and orthotics? Orthosis is the medical term for a brace, while orthosis is a plural form. The term orthotics refers to the science and practice, which includes patient assessment, fabrication, fit, and adjustment of an orthosis. So again, we can also use the terms orthotic device interchangeably with the term orthosis. So, but we already understood that splint, brace, and so on, these are very, originally the terms which were used the most, and orthosis is the term that actually came later during their maybe like last, 50 years, right? So when there was kind of this gentrification of medicine, kind of giving it the nicer and less obvious words and kind of moving it away from the dictionary. So, and the foot orthosis we have here, these are the special designed shoe inserts that support the feet and improve the foot posture. And what are orthoses made of? Rigid orthotics or functional orthotics are made from materials like plastic or carbon fiber. They are best for walking shoes or dress shoes with closed toes and low heels. And orthotics, how good are they for your feet? Orthotics can support the foot and reduce inflammation. So very high arches can stress muscles in the feet and lead to a number of conditions such as shin splints, knee pain, and plantar fasciitis. So orthotics can help prevent a person's foot from rolling excessively inward or outward. So that's what we get from the first page of Google and the general introduction. Now, as we move further, what we're going to see? We're going to see the following. That's what I started the whole thing, right? So that's the magazine, which gives me all kind of ads. Lower extremity review, that's their magazine. Orthotics in days, not months. Clinical gait assessment. So all kind of great things to come. And here, what are they suggesting? Foot and ankle conference, right? So, and then early orthotic intervention in pediatric patients, part 1, cerebral palsy. So, and here we get the terms. So typically the children with cerebral palsy encounter problem with gait and balance related issues associated with spasticity, dyskinesia, and weakness. Experts have long debated how early to intervene with bracing strategies that include ankle-foot orthosis and how long to maintain those interventions. And increasingly, surprise, right? The consensus seems to be emerging that earlier intervention is a better strategy, as is long-term commitment to wearing an AFO. So, as a result, setting goals, many pediatric therapists might consider early intervention only up to the age of 5 years, but we should be talking about anywhere from 6 months on, says Elaine Owen, a clinical professor and physical therapist at the London Orthotic Consultants. So, and ideally, you have a list of goals. Where do you want to be in with this year in 1 year old in 3 weeks, in 6 months? What do you want to achieve by age 2, 6, 10, 16? And how will those choices affect their life when they are 26, 46, and or 76? So because whatever we do now will affect their whole life and how much pain they are in. So that's making the case for their early intervention, right? And here, what you see right away, right? You see their famous things. The orthotics with nice cartoon characters or the movie characters. So the ones which are kind of looking cool. So look, if we go further and start seeing it, so here is the set of their orthotic goals. Alignment, functional, and rehabilitation. So alignment would be going for neutralize foot and ankle alignment, means prevent it from twisting inwards, right, or outwards. Neutralize knee alignment, either going backwards or bending forwards, right, the crouch gait. And then functional, establish heel strike, loading response, control descent of the foot, normalize foot alignment at a second rocker to prevent postural deformity. And you get the whole list of things, including the impact on the position of the trunk, maintain the straight foot projection angle, improve tibial progression, and the rehabilitative, increase the cadence, improve the endurance, encourage normal development, encourage independent ambulation, proximal strengthening, and so on. So look, if I were a person who has just dropped on earth and who have never heard anything about the orthotics, I would say, wow, this is a field which is doing great. Smart people setting really clever goals, using the language which is just fine, you know, like which is just in a nice balance. It's sort of a little bit fanciful, right? So you see like cadence, yes, yes. So, you know, improve endurance. Yeah, I can appreciate that. So then, you know, you get these ideas, establish the heel strike, control the descent of the foot. Like, you know, it all sounds incredibly nice. Like, you know, and if I were in your shoes hearing this for the first or even for the 10th time, and when this lady is setting their statements, well, we have to be planning ahead, we have to know and kind of really anticipate where we're going to be in 3 weeks, 6 months, but not only that, but in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on, and how it's going to affect your child's life, you know, like when they're 26, 47, 76. I mean, fantastic statements. So if I were just reading this at face value, say, hey, this field is doing absolutely fantastic. Like, excellent. Great goals, great, you know, great language, great everything. The only thing, does it actually work? Right? So you see, we are having a population there among, you know, our audience of the people, so of the parents who are, like among the most responsible and the most responsive parents who were doing all these early interventions, kind of committing themselves to the long-term use and everything and all this stuff, right? However, what do you actually see? You might see some so-called early success, but the point is that anything that is brought by these devices doesn't hold, right? And if we look at the way how the whole thing works, it's part of the chain of things where eventually you have those people, right? So you see where finally you get the guy who does the surgery and says, well, nothing can be done, and just get, if you don't operate, your child will become worse. So basically, this is what you end up with. So your typical experiences are very understandable. So first you hear all that, wow, like everything sounds so clever, everything sounds so nice, there's a whole language, orthotic management of cerebral palsy, and so on and so forth. I mean, like, it's all nice, all being clever, right? So you're being invited to the ankle foot conference here and so on, but it doesn't work, because if this thing worked, then, well, indeed, the orthotic specialist would have been able to prevent something, about the surgery, or would be able to really improve the condition when it comes to the children who are more affected, right? So, and all this conversation here typically, right? So you see, when they do this imagery, when they do these conversations, the main image, the main message is limited to the level 1 and level 2 child, right? So this is what we have to remember, that, if we get back to the GMFCS curves, so we remember the basic thing, that with the GMFCS curves, you are facing this type of the situation that you got the level 1 and the level 2 in the early parts of life, where you can barely see things, right, on the child's condition. Here they are, right? So level 1, level 2. So level 1 is where this kind of works. And I remind you this basic story. 90%, 95% of the total conversation at the cerebral palsy conferences revolves around the children level 1 and 2. A little bit goes to the level 3, so these are the wheelchair bound child who can still use their hands and so on, and absolutely nothing goes into the conversation about the level 4 and level 5, because all these things, they are not working there. On the other hand, if you listen to the same conferences and the conversations of their surgeons, what would they say? They would typically say that, by the way, regardless of what you do, indeed, up to like 100% of the level 2 children and up to 70% of the level 1 children would require a hip surgery at one point, right? So that's the ambition, that's kind of the perspective that they set. So this is a very important thing, and it's actually, of course, it's a very difficult situation to be in. Reading like that and listening to this and so on makes perfect sense. So when you look at this, and then, of course, what comes on top of this? Comes the conversation about the history. Actually, if you look here, for example, this thing about the lecture about the walking frames talks about the amazing facts that, that the walking frames, the walkers, have been in existence since Egyptian terracotta figurines, right? Or that, you know, that Hieronymus Bosch has painted the man with the rollator and on the way to hell, or on the way to whatever, the temptation of Saint Anthony. So basically, it's the idea which is so natural, so kind of indoctrinated, so obvious. And if you look here, this history speaks about the different ways how the devices were set for the club foot, the splits, and so on. So, and here, for example, a device from more than 100 years ago, and, you know, please note the extra statements, right? So you see, this is the invalid's body support, right? So because originally all this language has been about the invalids and, you know, like crookedness and all these other kind of language that today we find derogative. However, the actual fundamentals and the, you know, tools, they're coming from there. So what you see here, right? You see very obvious things: attach, support, connect, restrain, put another frame underneath. So like devices are very, very obvious. And then, okay, so that's fixing the bone, but look at this, right? So this kind of supports, which are replaced by the new technologies, materials, and ideas, but the basic idea and functionality are still the same. It proclaims about the special intelligence and the genius of their inventors. So you see, that's the point. I mean, it's part of my original conversation. I never forget, it was like 2003. We went with Krista to University of Leuven, you know, let's say to meet with some famous or like leading orthopedic professor in Belgium, right? And I asked him, you know, let's say kind of, I was much younger back then, right? So, and I was like, but isn't it a remarkable lack of the new ideas? Isn't it remarkably like banging your head around the same thing and kind of, you know, not showing any new result? He looked at me and said, you know, let's say, well, for us, it's a distinguished orthopedic tradition. Who are you to question? So that's exactly this point. It's a distinguished orthopedic tradition, right? So you see, like, but the basic ideas and functionality are still the same, right? So what would be the people from the industry saying, right? With all this for sport, for green, for kids, fixed cast braces, and so on, for them, it's a distinguished, glorified history of their profession. They are actually proud of it. They are not questioning. And that's the thing. So this is where we are. And continuing this thing, right? I mean, one of the things that I found here was, you know, some design professor who gave his students a limited number of materials. And, you know, you see, my students completed their first instant design challenge. So they had to create a foot orthosis for those living with cerebral palsy. What do you see here? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 devices. And of course, these are super crude, but what are they doing? What kind of idea is there? The same. If the foot is looking down, push it from the bottom, make it, you know, force it upwards. That's it. And you see, this is from the students who never thought about the idea, right? So you see, they were just kind of given this as a kind of design challenge. But now we look at the people who spend their entire life doing the same thing. Is it much of a difference? No. It's the same idea. And the question is really there, right? It's just to, you know, you have two perspectives. One is to say, okay, guys, but it doesn't work. Well, the question will be, but like, okay, why do you say it doesn't work, right? There are sort of mildish cases where it works. There are cases with people who had their broken leg or whatever, who actually used the braces and kind of helped them. And the fact that it doesn't work for severe cases, it's not a problem of ours. It's just those we do everything right, but it's just those cases are too difficult. See, that's what we face again and again and again as a standard kind of discussion in the CP field. So that we do everything right. Our intuition is absolutely brilliant. The fact that a first-year student, upon 10-minute introduction into cerebral palsy, will come with exactly the same idea as the person who spent countless years kind of perfecting their craft and meeting hundreds and thousands of patients, doesn't bother anyone. The fact that it's been the same 100, 200, 500, 2,000 years ago doesn't bother anyone. So, and of course, when you see such a unanimous kind of level of approval, you say, well, like, who am I to question? Because also, like, your first idea is just, look, my child's foot is not straight. What am I going to do? Right? So you see, you look at, something like that. Right? So you see the distorted foot and say, geez, it must be really uncomfortable. I wish, like, we just have turned it and put it straight. Like, it's so natural, so obvious to have this thing. So that's really what we meet, right? And then, of course, there are kind of additional attempts to do it a bit more fancifully, right? So you see, for example, that would be one suggestion, right? So you see, to put more pressure, to add extra tension lines, not just limit. So, to get the spread of the toes and the new technologies, right? See, the James Dyson award-winning orthosis counteracts hypertonia in children with cerebral palsy. Again, that's all talk, right? And the thing is, what we are seeing, okay, so that's an extra support for the digits. It's an extra one for the wrist and so on. It's much nicer than before, right? So I mean, like, again, if we compare this thing with the plastic device that your child is being given, this is a significant upgrade. However, the ideas there are still very much the same, right? You still want the same mechanical ideas. So that's really the situation that we are in. And, if you look further, you've got just even nicer technologies here, right? And then, like, you get articles, discussions. And you see, the thing is that, of course, you also have to remember this other thing, like the ankle foot orthosis and so on, that the profession itself is not limited to the cerebral palsy, right? So you see, as you have seen even in the first part here, right? So you see, it actually deals with the shoe inserts, how to deal with arthritis, right? So you see kind of extreme version, how to minimize the inflammation and the pressure points and so on. So which makes the whole field larger, and that's once that makes the whole field larger, again, what happens to the more severe cases of cerebral palsy? Their relative role becomes smaller and smaller, right? So, you know, if you take 100, if you only were looking at the kind of application of the orthosis in the cerebral palsy, you would say, okay, you know, we have got 50 milder cases, 50 more severe cases. Okay, even in half of the milder cases, it doesn't work at all, right? So you see in the, you know, 50 more severe cases, it doesn't work. So then you start asking a question. Maybe it's not a good idea, or maybe it's something wrong with that, right? Maybe it's too intuitive. But then you throw in another, I don't know, 900 regular people with arthritis and so on, with, you know, arthritis, broken foot, all this kind of thing, and say now you got 1,000 people. And for this, you know, 925 people, suddenly you say, well, it's a great idea, it works well. But, you know, guys, you are there on the fringe, so whatever happens to you is just, you know, but we are sorry for you, but it's the neurology, it's wrong signals, whatever. So, you know, like our orthotics are fine, they're very helpful devices, you know, venerated by time, but, you know, you are not lucky. So that's what happens over and over and over again in our field. Instead of counting from the other end, right? So you see everybody takes the easy cases first and tries to avoid the thinking about, well, how much of their success is accidental. So that's really the situation that we are in. And as we look at this picture, let's get a little bit of the question marks, right? And the question mark that we would have in first place would actually come in a very simple fashion. What you're seeing here, right, you're seeing that the ankle foot orthosis, whether it's a basic device, right, so you see which has one pivot, right, one point of rotation, or even if it's kind of fancier device, like, for example, this, which also has additional points of load application, right? But the pivot is still the same. So it's accentuated, but still you've got the same single pivot through which the action is happening. So that's what we have to understand. So if we draw what's going on here, you have the so-called pivot, and then you've got the loads which are being applied through. So with the idea of actually making the whole thing rotate around this pivot. That's what the central idea is. In fact, it's so obvious, right? So you see, if the foot is too far down, well, let's try to rotate it and get it moved forward, get it moved upwards around this pivot. So that's the key language, the key kind of source of the application. What's the big picture behind it? The big picture behind it is to do this kind of additional lateral supports, as you see here. See, when we are bringing the rigid support on the sides, well, you know, this is just one-sided, but you can imagine the other one, right? So you see, when we bring the rigid supports from the outer side, we sort of prevent and try to restrict the shift and the displacement sideways, right? And when we create this extra tension that pulls it upwards, right? And then use this pivot by doing this action, right? So what we are supposed to do, we are supposed to do the stretch of the backside, right? So you see that the Achilles would be stretched, so that the one that otherwise prevents and limits the arching, sort of the mobility of the foot. So that would be the central idea. I mean, as simple and as kind of obvious as it gets. Something like this and so on, right? And all these kind of conversations about the deformities and the limited mobility. So, and okay. Ankle motion short of the neutral position, right? So you see, that's what we see here if we open the image in the new tab. So, yes, the logic is very clear, right? So we got the pivot, so we test, we claim that the restraint, restriction, and so on is on the other side, right? So you see, there is not enough give that goes through the Achilles, right? And we would say, oh, let's try to bring it there. So that's the logic. And that's kind of about it. Now, what is my first point? It's very simple. This is all nice in theory. Let's look at real people. That's my first statement. Let's look at real people. Let's see what happens when they actually move. And the first point, see here, Katalin, we're waving at you, right? So you see, like, again, what we are seeing here, right, is a foot which has this deformation. However, when we start studying this foot, what are we going to discover? We're going to discover that this foot actually does two things. The foot, first of all, experiences the primary load at the level of the wedging between the upper body, which comes at an angle from the top, right, and the foot itself that grips at the ground. So the very first thing that is happening is this effect of the wedging, right? So you see, I'll try to put it there. So it's a wedge. So it gets wedged into the thing. Now, that's a very important consideration, because if we compare this part, which experiences the loads on the front, and this part, which experiences the pull at the back, they're not equal. You know, they are in a different status. So this one, which experiences the wedging loads, undergoes much greater level of the mechanical challenges. You know, literally, right? So you see, it's being squeezed, right? So you see, if you get to squeeze something, where would be, you know, you look at this deformation, where would be the greatest load concentrations, right? So you see, the greatest load concentrations would be on the inner side. This is where you've got the concentration that goes into the millimeters, right? And we have to remember that bodies are made out of extremely soft materials, right? So you see, which actually goes all the way from the millimeters to the micrometers and so on and so forth. So that's the key point. And actually, that's the exclamation point that we have to keep in mind, that the primary thing that happens is the control of this wedge. And what is necessary there to first is to prevent the destruction, right? This wedge from being locally destroyed. That's the first point. And the second thing is that to have it at a fashion which should be smooth enough, right? So you see that this action would go smoothly. So it wouldn't come into the holding, 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 then the jump, then again holding, holding. Because that is going to dynamically take it away out of the map. It's going to be too much of a jerk, too much of an unpredictable situation. And the third thing is, of course, you have to put this wedge in context of the circumferences of, let's put it, the circumferences of the stretch, which are being associated with this wedge on the other side, right? So, and that would be best seen. So, we go back to this and we draw this wedge. So that's this wedging effect, right? So you see, but then this wedging effect has to have the exit part, right? And then once we got to the exit part, then we have to be able to contain it. Just look. Contain it here, contain it there, contain it there, and then, okay, contain it in the middle, contain it at the heel. So that will be the level of containment, right? So you see it will be 1, 2, 3, 4 would be going on, switching it under the ankle, right? Well, under the bones of the ankle, right? And then getting into this transition that goes here from the heel bone itself, right? So you're going through the back there. So if I would redraw it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the wedge that has to be able to deal with the loads which converge like that, right? So you see the body converges over the stationary leg. So that's what we're dealing with. And once we understand that, we say, okay, that's an interesting drawing. Do we have additional supports for this idea? And then we look at this and say, that's interesting, right? Because what does it show us? That shows us that actually the primary orientation of the heel and the primary connection, even the primary connection of the Achilles, goes through the heel tip. It goes through the heel tip. It doesn't go through the heel bottom. If you look at it at face value and ask yourself a very primitive question, like, how could this part be the primary support if it has this fascia and fat only? Because if that was a primary support, it should have got some transformation. Of course, you can say, well, but it's because there is a nice arch there with the points and so on. But that's kind of a questionable argument because, in fact, this is the first question that you have to be asking. Is this the bottom of the foot which actually matters? Or is this the heel tip that matters more for the ankle? So that's a central question, right? And without having a choice of answer for this question, we're not moving anywhere. Because, here we're then talking about the wedge and the exit, so the convergence and the divergence. And we talk about the multiple lines of resistance where the heel cord, the Achilles, would be the last one. If we draw this, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So the primary ones would be here, right? And now, you know, like if you look at it like this, you know, the entire foot starts making sense. You know, because if I were to rotate it like that, right? So you see, then it's easier to see those lines. See, if this is where it wedges, so this part has to resist, right? So you see it wedges in, but as it wedges in, there is a stretch that comes out. So it's this part that has to be able to handle it. Then it has to be the next one, right? Because the, you know, the stretch increases. Then it's the next one, and so on. So it has to go all the way to the heel tip, and that's where the key attachment goes. So that's a really important point to understand, that without like really analyzing what's happening in reality, we move into the convenient domain of the formula, but we are not looking at the real fit. And that's really the key point. We have to start looking at the like real bodies and start zooming a bit more into how the whole thing actually works, you know, taking into account the living body, taking into account all this distributed connections to the fascia and all the elements, rather than just using the formula. So as if it was a sort of skinless, fascialess, and so on. So the point is that it first reacts to the skin. So those nice pivots which are being drawn, they are just formulas of a relatively simplistic kind. And then you see, as we look here, I'm moving the foot, right? So you see, but look, this foot is undergoing the load transformation. See, that's the very clear illustration of what happens there. You know, and you see this kind of load might not look spectacular to you, but that's the key thing. You know, if we can see, that means that there are numbers, you know, like there's a sort of several millimeters of the compression which are happening there. So these are the elements which are creating those depth concentrations. And that's why before we start looking at anything, we have to say, okay, look, what the child is doing under the circumstances. She's distributing her loads according to the best possible combination of the grip to the ground, the distribution, and kind of prevention of the extreme concentrations which would go into that ankle wedge. And when we do the tests, right, so you see, look, my tests by doing the bending of the ankle, right, or by doing the, you know, the flexion or the dorsiflexion test of the foot, they would look no different from the test of someone else who tests them, you know, for the range of movement. But I'm looking for completely different things. So what I'm pointing out here is exactly that. That's a formation of those wedges. And those wedges are first being formed even as far, you know, as such as a little, you know, like level as their skin deformations and the attachments which are happening there. As we move on, you see, you know, I start studying it, and that's my first point. So that's really what I want you to understand. The primary thing is the wedge, and it's the heel tip. So it's this combination. That's where the primary link goes. And if we were just not blinded by the simple drawings, but looked even what we actually have in anatomy, You know, this picture says it all. That, you know, if you look at it this way, you understand that if this part, which even has a name, the retinaculum, which actually makes sure that the heel bone is well inserted into the ankle, without this proper attachment, the other elements, they would be not really able to function. Because, you know, if you lose that primary link, then you have one of the two troubles with the ankle. You have the trouble which either is going to be too tight, or is just going to be like as a part of the way to keep the heel in place, right? To deal with those extreme unpredictables, you know, and the challenges which come from the otherwise not controllable wedge. Or it's just going to be completely loose, just switched off. So, but the key point is this: unless we change the first understanding that the angles that we should be looking at are these angles which are connecting the heel and the ankle at the level of the maximum possible wedging deformation of the foot, you know, of the ankle, then we are having a completely wrong image of standing or like of anything related to the control of the leg. Because otherwise, you know, we tend to think about it like, okay, you know, it's a kind of boxy thing where we just sort of put those boxes together and say, you know what, okay, that's a support from the bottom. This support from the bottom is what is important. You've got the supporting points and so on, which is not the case. You know, you have to look at the first connections which are working through it. And that's a very first kind of message about the thing. And then the second message is, of course, they're like even simpler. What we want for proper action, we want the foot which is going to be alive and which is going to be able to like respond through all of its active elements. So when we are doing the illustration like this, we're effectively reducing the foot to one pivot. We are assuming that this is the main element, and all the other articulations, all the other areas which are able to have a dynamic response, that all the other elements are not important. So they could be kind of artificially separated and put into the lesser order of importance compared to the actual pivoting at the end. But even that, if you think about the pivoting at the end, there is no pivoting at the end. There is no single point at which it goes. You know, at the very least, it goes around that circumference. So that's the important thing to understand, that pivots don't exist in real tissues. So we respond with real tissues, not with pivots. So that's why, you know, like reducing it to simplicity doesn't really work so well. And that has been my kind of simple statement, which I've been using like for the last 20 odd years. I mean, that was my first realization. How could the device possibly work if it uses one source of forces and it uses one degree of freedom, one source of the change, whilst what we have there is 27 bones, each of them having at least 3 degrees of change in, out, up, down, left, right, and another 2 of the rotations inwards and outwards, right? So that means that you've got, at the very least, what does it make? That makes 135 possible freedoms within the food, and we are trying to control that those 135 degrees of freedom with 1. You know, it's like you've got the water leaking and you're plugging one hole and you've got 134 holes left, and you're desperately holding and you're saying, well, you know, like this is that's the most important hole, I'm going to hold that, without even like evaluating the others. So, and that's what it is, you know, really. It's just the moment you start looking at it from a little bit just more open perspective, the ideas of the orthotics, they don't hold any water, because at the same time, regardless of what the intention is about this kind of their master pivot, right, as sort of implied there, but we have to accept the fact that the rest of the food is going to be dead. You know, it's not going to have any activations through the remaining connections. And this is where, again, we want to look at the realities. And you see, that's a case which we've just seen in May. A hemiplegic case, which is really easy to, well, I mean, like, it's not, the left foot is not really great, but it's working better, right? And what you see here, as I do the micro loads from the bottom, what you see that even with the softest load, this foot has a tendency to spread. It's, once you load it, it gets wider. See, I was just pointing this out with my own hand. See, as you like land it, it widens, it spreads. That's the first property. So you see, and if you press and you say, no, but my foot doesn't spread so much. Well, that's exactly the point. First, it has the ability to spread, but then that spreading system is being tied together so much that that tendency to spread actually powers it. So you see, you are twice better than the person without the spread, because you have the spread plus your spread is not visible, because it's being, look, this is a foot which is not great. It's better than the bad foot. So what you see with this foot? You see with this foot, as I put the load, it spreads. But if we wanted to make this foot better, we want to keep that property, so it has the ability under the load, it first has a tendency to spread, but we want to insert much stronger springs into it, right? So that it indicates the tendency to spread, but it's connected so well together that by actually by a tendency to spread, it powers the bands which keep it together, so that they create this elastic, they become the storage of the elastic energy. So when you walk, you can release it. So that's why, you know, you are twice as good. You have the spread, but that spread is not obvious because you are well connected. The channel with the floppy foot is the one the bad food that doesn't do much, right? That's the food which doesn't spread and the food that doesn't respond. What is our first idea? Make that food alive. If we put the orthotic thing there, formally, we declare that yes, there is a master pivot, but in reality, once we put this thing on, what happens? The rest of the food is dead. There's nothing that is going to go through this food. So that's really the key challenge. That's the key problem with the orthotics, is that what do you choose? And this is really the central point. And then you see, I start looking at the food which is not so good, right? And what do we see here in the food which is not so good? I'm trying to do the same imitation of the loads from the bottom. You see that this food cannot spread. So it doesn't have that connectivity, it just comes as a lump. And then, as we start looking further, of course, that boy was very, very interesting in another fashion, that you were, in his case, you were able to see the separate role of the skin, the separate role of the plantar fascia, right? It's like really massive link here. So he really grips with the skin. And the skin itself is being like very separate from the food. But then if we look further, we're going to see these lines. And these lines, they matter. So that's my point, that you cannot declare that there is just one kind of, where is it? Yeah, that there is just one master pivot and everything else doesn't matter. All of those mobilities, and by mobilities, right? So you see, every time there is a mobility, there is a wedge. Where is the wedge? There is a problem. See, that's a very important thing to understand, that we look at it as if it was just a mechanical item. It's not, it's alive. So if you bend it, where you've got the so-called mobility is a curse. You have to be able to absorb the loads which concentrate at the point and distribute them through. So, because, otherwise a system has a tendency to collapse, right? So you see, I put this one, that's a mobility thing. So look, if whatever is sitting inside this wedge is undergoing the extreme loads, get yourself a bottle of water, get yourself, let's say a can of any fizzy drink or whatever, and start squeezing it. What's going to happen? This is the part where the structural weakness is, where it has a tendency to buckle. So the first thing, and that's a very important point to understand, that even for the child of a so-called level 5 or whatever, high levels of the GMFCS, this is the key thing, is to understand that the body is equally clever, right? That it's not broken, it's not stupid, it doesn't make this kind of silly mistakes. If something looks as bad as it is and kind of being that deformed, that means that there is even a better reason, right? So you see, this is a really key point to kind of come to terms. If we see something looking bad, like looking very far from the way how it is with a healthy person, well, you have to understand that, well, the body, the real situation is actually worse, and the body just takes the best solution out of the possible ones. So the body always makes the best solution. It prevents something even worse from happening. So, and that is really the key point. When we look at those, you say, you know, look, this wedge, this link from the first metatarsal to the fifth metatarsal has to work. So in that respect, the single pivot doesn't have the master pivot property, right? So you see the one of the one that comes through the orthotics. And then as we start looking further, you see, look, you see the combination of folds, right? Because this is a little bit higher, this is a little bit lower, but that refers to the same level of the line which goes through the foot. So, and in that respect, there is a wedge that comes at the skin. So you see each of those layers has to be able to handle those wedges without being incompetent and without being unable to, you know, like recover, without getting into buckling. So that's what we actually see. And then, you know, we have that fold. And then what else? We have this folding, right? So you see the fold that goes along the middle. And you see here, you see that's actually turned out to be a very nice picture. So why this boy is unable to do the spread? You know, because you see his foot just collapses along the single line. If we would put the ankle foot orthosis on him, are we going to help him? Probably not, because that's exactly the case. We are going to take away even whatever remains out of life in this foot, and you know, we're not going to be able to bring it back. See, and here I'm just showing, see, this, I was moving it from the top towards the stationary bottom. Here, I'm moving the heel in respect to the stationary top. These are different movements. These are different loads which are happening in different directions and which kind of reclaim different wedges. And this is the view from the top. So where you can see that those lines which are connecting those lines, right? So you see, we talked about the wedge and we talked about the lines, right? So those lines which are supposed to deal with this wedge are not competent. So if these lines are not competent, what do you expect? You know, you would expect that the most naturally, the first line which is going to emerge is going to be the fusion of the skin all the way from the big toe to the inside of the shin. That's the fusion, because the other lines are not competent. That's it. So you see, in fact, the things are actually quite simple. And, you know, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the activation. We're looking for the ways to bring those links, which are going to come and enable those transitions between the wedges and the ankles. And as we go further, you know, that's what you see, that the primary position from which we have to reference everything has to be the position that comes with the heel tip as a base. So that's the triangle which you have to be looking at first, not any of those parts. at the bottom. You see, the bottom or the top is a bonus. So first, it means that you have to get this link that works all the way through, provides these convergences, and then once the heel tip holds on, then this grip is able to expand outwardly into the bottom of the heel and upwardly into the Achilles. So that's really the key idea. And if we, for example, look here, we will see some of those examples. See, here I'm testing the grip of the heel. And the grip of the heel is not straightforward. So, she's having much better connection through the primary ankle to the heel tip line, but the heel, the skin link, the depth, the ingrowth, the Velcro through the heel tip is not as kind of well positioned. So if that's her primary line, if it doesn't spread anywhere further, so then of course, the actual foot, the other part, right, is going to be very much excluded. So it has to connect here and then start at the heel tip, and that starts spreading. In fact, for Antea, like this is actually not doing too badly, but the bottom part, this is where you've got the question marks. But, I think it's very spectacular when you can see how important is this grip that occurs at the level of the heel. Because you see, once again, this is me moving it, right? As I am moving it, I'm not obviously applying any big loads, right? But if she steps, that means that with this grip, not only this grip has to hold, but that means that if this grip holds, that means that it's going to cause the convergence of the loads in the areas which I'm demonstrating. And again, those areas have to be competent to handle this kind of loads. So that's what it means to bring the life back into the actual, into the actual foot. And, really, there is no much ways of making it simpler. It, on the one hand, explains you why it doesn't work. But then, of course, also we have to take into account, the entire thing. Because if you start looking at the whole foot into a bigger picture, now you see that all he has makes perfect sense. Because in that respect, you can see this is a line of force distributions that goes all the way to the hip, and his leg perfectly adjusts to the twist, because, and the twist itself adds tension, which is missing through the joints and through the connections. So as a result, he is able to take the entire load, right? And that, of course, brings us back to this point that it's the torsion which is being the primary type of response, right? Not any other loads. Remember this one. So the torsions as the primary load. And the torsions, of course, they create local force concentration. So, that's a very simple logic. The body is clever. And here, what I'm showing is that, well, within that line, if it's a total length, he's able to handle it, but the knee itself is not strong enough. So you see, look at that, right? As I'm trying to move the bottom, what does it do? It creates this displacement at the knee. So what does it mean? What to do next? Foot now, you block the foot, now you're going to block the knee, then you're going to block the hip, and so on, right? And then this is how you're going to get those, full body contraptions. But those full body contraptions they don't work neither. So, and here you see that's kind of the testing that we're making. We're looking at the best possible grip at the ground. We're looking at the ways of recovering, right? So you see, getting the recovery of the wedge. You always have to look at it through the wedge. If the wedge is not competent, then you can't expect anything else, no other good things to happen. And the foot is really optimized into dealing with these distributions throughout this 135 things. And you see, of course, if I look at it, if I'll start looking at this movement this way, I realize, what's happening there. This is a system where his wedge is not competent. That's it. So the system is going to prevent this wedge from happening. In his scenario, what you're seeing is not even reaching the level of the heel cord. It's reacting all the way at the line, of the toes extensors. You see, this, we talked about the wedge and then multiple lines before it comes to the heel. So if we look at this, see, you've got the explanation here, right? The peroneus brevis tendon, the one that sits right behind the bone. And if you look at the bone, you say, gee, this looks strange, right? But for you, this view is quite familiar. See, this is the part which is preventing the wedging from happening. So once you understand those things, it's actually quite straightforward. And then you start figuring out what's happening. You can see, through the lines of the rotation and so on. And look, fortunately, nowadays, what is our central message? That with the vibration tools, we got to the stage where you are in the position, what you see is what you work with. You're no longer being scared by this idea, oh, geez, I have to work with, 27 bones and their connections and 135 possible, at least a minimal estimate of the degrees of freedom that I have to handle. I've been telling people, look, of course, we always wanted to get the activation of the toes, for example, right? Or the activation of the fingers, the digits in general. But if we were trying to deal with each of these joints individually, and let's say, if we were to put, 10 hours into one joint, right? Just to get the toes covered, you would need 150 hours. You got 2 feet, it's already 300 hours. So you see, you'll almost spent a year and you just got the 10 hours per joint there. That's difficult. So with the vibro tools, what we're really having is the ability to cover more at once, cover it deeper, cover it the premuscular way, cover it comfortably, and actually, cover a lot at once. So that's why we can take the foot or the foot ankle or the hand wrist at their current state and say, what, our priority is to keep it alive, right? And within this being alive, start delivering the stimulus, start delivering the connection, start delivering the distribution of those elements which are otherwise excluded, which are not alive enough. As opposed to taking the life away, whatever little is there, by just completely eradicating it and leaving just one pivot and one type of load. So that's really a compact version of what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say, right, is that as we see, yes, at first it might sound and kind of look overwhelming that suddenly from the very simple picture or very simplified picture, which kind of you just everybody seem to be happy with, but which doesn't work. So suddenly we start recognizing how much life is there, how everything is working, and then say, how am I going to address it? Like how am I going to chase all of those multiple degrees of freedom? So in that sense, the good news about the vibration tools that they're really kind of giving us a major amplification, major ability to scale, and major ability to get it much easier. And like instead of making this very unwelcome choice, like get out, stay alive, but face the trouble of the twists and turns, or give up the living part, but at least try to sort of put in a more comfortable position, at least temporarily. So in that respect, we are in a much better position that you don't need to make this hard choice, because we can keep it alive and actually start working with it, right? And if it's necessary, we can, for some transitions or other things, if the child is big, right? So for safety reasons, we can use the orthosis just to prevent the unexpected loss. But work-wise, we are able to move it up. So I guess that would be the thing.